Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of Side Quest.
If I may propose a soundbite, there are 1,000,001 things that could be discussed on just this novel alone in the franchise, and you could spend decades talking about so many minute details to the greater grand picture. So there are so many things that weren't discussed that could have been, but there's only so many hours in the day and so many minutes in a podcast.
I missed all that, Chris. Can you repeat that for me?
No.
Okay. Good morning, Slava.
Hey, Jonathan. Good morning.
How about this last episode of Dune? You ready?
I am ready.
Me too. I'm very much been looking forward to this. Before we dive in, though, what's something you learned this week?
What's something I learned this week? Well, it's a stupid thing. I learned that
Great. Good opener.
You know those ads on Instagram you see when you're scrolling through? Hey, I didn't know I was paying for, 3 Netflix accounts.
Yeah. Rocket money?
Yes, but no.
Same, but different.
I was going through my subscriptions on my Apple ID because I wanted to cancel a free trial of an app. Then I realized I paid for a stupid app, and the app was $189.
Ooh.
And I didn't notice it on the credit card, not because I'm, Mr. Moneybags, but because we had some vacation expenses come through, and I just quickly paid it, didn't even think about it, and I was like, oh, well, I have this app that cost me $200, but it's an app that ChatGPT's books, so and they have preset books. It's not, you can't upload a book or give it a book to summarize, but they have a lot of business books and marketing books, and it gives you a 25-page summary of each book. So I'll definitely use it. But that's what I learned.
But you bought
short form.
It's not subscription. It's just the full purchase of the app was $190.
Oh, no, it's a subscription. Yeah, it was a subscription, which I promptly canceled.
Oh, good. $190, $16 a month. Nice. Classic.
What about you?
That's a good question. This week has been a little less learning than I would prefer, but I would say that I learned new ways to work with some of my counterparts at work, where how I like to work versus how they like to work is different. And so having to change my methodology, because normally when I get an idea for something, I will write up a summary and then poke them with a message. And then one of them was like, hey, I don't have time to deal with this right now because they're on deadline, which totally fair. And I'm talking about something that's next March that we need to prepare for. It's this big trade show. And they were like, hey, I don't have time to talk about this right now. Also, it'd be better if you just did a kickoff meeting. And I was like, I mean, yes, I agree. But here's the thing. This is next March. And so just coming to terms with how I want to work versus how other people want to work is different, which is okay. But it's a reminder that teamwork is more important than my preferences. That's what I relearned this week.
It's a good lesson.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to introduce some wonderful guests that we have today to talk to us about Arrakis, Paul, the Duke Atreides, and everything Bene Gesserit. First, we have Spenser, longtime reigning champion. Hey, Spenser.
Hello. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Slava.
Hey, Spenser.
And then we have Kristopher, 12-time reigning champion of Dune, or more. He can't remember the number. That's how much he reigns over Dune.
Hello, Jonathan. Hello, Slava. Hello, Spenser.
Chris is coming in to take over the reigning championship here, Spenser, that you've been holding for so long. So I hope you got your britches pulled up.
Yeah, ready to roll. Got to defend my championship here.
Good. What did you guys learn this week, Spenser?
I was part of a conversation with some coworkers, and it was just interesting. They were kind of bantering back and forth, and they were teasing each other. It wasn't really work related. It was just kind of coworkers talking about his dad had to move in with him, and the other coworker was teasing him. But it was just interesting to see how small teasing or maybe in essence conflict can generate conversation. And maybe an overarching themes is conflict can cause us to grow in relationship with each other if you go through conflict. I don't know. It was just more of a meta thing, I think, in my head, just watching people interact.
What say you, Chris?
One of the things I'd say I learned this week is that difficult conversations are important to have sometimes. An artist that I've been contracting to do some work for a project I've been working on, and I wasn't happy with some of the results that was being shown. And so talking with them through what their process is, and we both came to realize that there was a key piece of information that was not communicated between the two of us about what the desired delivered product would be for this. And when we both realized that, everything kind of turned around, and the spirits of the whole thing were uplifted, and, so that's what I learned this week.
Cool. Well, let's dive into Arrakis and Dune and the hierarchical challenges that come when you serve an emperor. Chris, do you want to give us a quick summary, since you're our resident Dune expert, possibly ecologist?
Well, I would say my older brother's far more well-read in Dune. He has read all of the books in the entire franchise, both by Frank Herbert and his son.
Oh, wow.
I myself have only read the one book and part of the second book. Most of the things that I thoroughly enjoyed in the first book were not necessarily in the first half of the second book, the part that I read, and so I didn't continue the series. But having said that, Dune is a science fiction epic written by Frank Herbert. It was originally written and published in December of, I believe, 1963 as a part of a serial for Analog Magazine. And then, because the first part of that was such a success, he continued the story, and those two serials became combined into the novel that was published in 1965.
Oh, fun.
The basic sense of what the story is that it follows a noble family, the Atreides, in particular. At the start of the story, the son of the ducal heir Paul Atreides, as they get transplanted from their homeworld onto a new world, Arrakis, which has a special compound called spice that has a lot of properties to it that make it very sought after, very desired. Everybody wants it, and it only exists in this one place. And so they've been moved there by decree of the Emperor, and there's sabotage and espionage, and the house gets betrayed, falls apart, and then we see Paul befriend the natives, to put it simply, of this planet, and then rise up to challenge the Emperor and claim the throne.
Well put, Christopher. Good summary. Jonathan, let me ask you something as you read the book. I know this is your second time reading it through. This is my first time reading it through to completion. But as I read it, I was very excited. It drew me in. The writing was great, and I couldn't put it down. I even text you numerous times throughout the read, far ahead of where we were recording, because I just thought what was happening was so exciting and captivating. What did you think as you read the book? Let's talk about how both of us reacted to reading the book for the first time, or in your case, second time.
Yeah, actually, Chris is the one who encouraged me to read this back when we were working on a pretty hefty creative project that is kind of in limbo now, but we both still long to finish it. And I said this before the episode, but Chris has like 4-0 on me for influencing me to dive into media that I either A, wasn't aware of, or B, didn't plan on diving into. And he's 4-0. I've not yet succeeded in asking him to, or getting him to read things that I want him to, even though I would really enjoy it. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. As for the book, I remember really enjoying it, but it's been so long. I think I read it in 2016. That sounds about right. So, yeah, like 8 years ago. And I forgot how good of an author Frank Herbert was. And one of the things we covered in one of the previous episodes with Herbert's writing style was he only read, 4.5 years of sci-fi and was like, I can do this. And then just whips this thing out and just nails it, which is just incredible. And then we'll get into this later, but Chris mentioned when I invited him on the show, he was he said he was reading the Analog Magazine series version, and I guess there were some changes made. Not big ones, but we'll get into that a little later in this episode, because I didn't know that it was originally released in a serial. And I kind of miss that type of journey where, people release parts of a story. And I think that even speaks better to Herbert's writing style, where he was able to keep your attention the whole time. And there's really no downtime, even though there's a good pace. But I think that it would be harder to be like, okay, how am I going to make this next 3-page short story, like chapter, that I'm releasing on this magazine interesting and keep the people intrigued? So anyway, that's how I engage with it, even more so now, knowing that it was released piece by piece instead of as a full-length narrative to start.
Yeah, for sure. That's what kept me engaged, is the writing style. As soon as we started, interesting things are happening, and there's never a lull. Even if there's a short stop for a little bit of exposition, or when Paul and Cheney are getting to know each other, to use a euphemism, there's this little lull, but it picks up right after that. There's always a sense of something around the corner. You never get to rest, and I really, really enjoyed that. And that's a lot of the questions that we had, too. It had to do with just some things that Herbert just let kind of sit there, right? Like, what is the Gom Jabbar? What happens next after Paul takes over? I mean, we find out probably in book 2, but he just leaves certain things hanging, but not in a way where you're confused and unsure of what's going on. It's in a way that helps you contemplate, or use your imagination, like, what could be the next step that Paul takes, or what could the Gom Jabbar be?
Yeah.
In detail. So I love that about the book.
Well, if you wanted me, I could directly jump in and answer what the Gom Jabbar is. So in the appendices of the novel, which from what I've read is not a part of the original serial of the story, but in the published novel version of it, they have an appendix in the back of it which has a glossary of terms. And under it, the section for Gom Jabbar, what it says, and I quote, "The high-handed enemy, that specific poison needle tipped with metacyanide used by the Bene Gesserit proctors in the death alternative test of human awareness."
You got it. There's your answer, Slava.
There's my answer.
While you guys were reading it, what stood out to you? I know, Spencer, this was your first time reading it through, so let's go with you first. What were your thoughts, questions, impressions, likes, dislikes, hates, etc.?
I had originally tried reading Dune, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I just was not interested. It didn't grab me. I do a lot of audiobooks, so that's where I do most of my reading, and I had used an Audible credit, so I just returned the book. I was like, I don't know if I'll ever get back into this. And then Jonathan told me a couple months ago, or however long ago it was, that, they were going to do Dune, read through it. And so I was like, all right, I'll give it another shot. And then for whatever reason this time, it really just seemed to grab me. Part of it, too, was I had watched the Dune movie that came out, I think it was last year. And having a little bit of reference from the movie and then listening to the book, I don't know, it just helped me, I guess, engage a little bit more with the story. So yeah, I really enjoyed it this second time, well, technically first time through, but second attempt at it. Yeah, I loved it. I liked just all the political intrigue, all the backstabbing going on. Like,
Big fan, huh?
Big fan. But it was just interesting to see how it all played out. I don't know if there was anything. I don't know, I just liked it all. The desert planet, seeing people having to transition from living on, I guess maybe what you call maybe a normal planet to a complete desert planet, and how they adapted. I guess maybe one dislike that I had, and it kind of makes sense now, but to me it felt from one chapter to the next, all of a sudden we're jumping to different scenes, that all of a sudden something's happening with Paul's mom or something's happening with Paul. To me, sometimes the transition felt very abrupt. There were certain times where it didn't feel like it was being led into. It was just, oh, we're here and we're interacting with this scene or this group of people. But that's just my own personal dislike. Overall, though, I thought it was a very good story.
Don't you think that the jumping around, though, was similar to other fantasy novels that you've read? Like Sanderson. specifically thinking about Sanderson.
specifically.
Also, Will White, where he jumps from like scene to scene.
For whatever reason with Sanderson, I feel like I'm able to track a little bit more.
Hmm.
Will White, yes, I think sometimes too I feel a little bit out of place where he's just jumping right into something and there. To me personally, it felt like there was no like lead into it. So I just have to like adjust my perspective maybe of how, whatever's going on. And I like Sanderson's writing. I feel like I'm able to follow him. I think Herbert wrote this back in the 60s or whatever it was, just a different time, a little bit different writing style. To me, it just took a little bit longer to get used to.
Now, that makes sense. Chris, what about you? Because you read the Analog Magazine serials first, right? Then you read the book.
No, actually, I think it's been such a long time since I first read it. I don't remember it exactly, but I believe it was sometime when I was in middle school. And similar to Spencer, I think I picked up the book, tried reading it, and couldn't get into it. And so I didn't do anything further with that. And to be honest, I do not know if it was the David Lynch film or if it was the video game by, I believe, Cryo Entertainment.
Okay.
I think it was was it 1992 or 1993?
Video game? There's a video game?
Yes. So there's actually, I will try and be really, really brief with this. There are two video games that were being produced kind of at the same time by two completely different unrelated companies, but I think they may have had the same publisher or something. I'm not entirely sure. The game that I had played was released first and called Dune, and it was created by Cryo Interactive and then published by Virgin Interactive. And it's this weird kind of like RPG visual novel, heavily story-driven, but has a clunky kind of RTS game mechanic as well tied into it. And the story, I mean, to account for the type of gameplay, the story's really... There's a family called the Atreides, there's a family called the Harkonnen, and then there is the Emperor. Like, that's kind of the similarities. And there's not much. It doesn't really follow the story. It's got the same characters, the same names, but it does its own thing to get to the same ending of Paul being the Emperor.
Huh.
And it was a combination, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, of that video game and then the David Lynch film from the 80s, that having gone through those, I then went and read the book and then really, really started loving it after that.
What about it did you start loving it? What sparked? So you got interested in the book because of the video game and the movie. Then you read the book the first time. What was the thing that, sparked in you to read it a 10th time?
Well, what really, really drew me into the book when I started getting into it was, I guess, the sort of like corporate, professional, personal court dynamics of the Atreides family. Of all of these high lieutenants, high trusted people that are within the family that have all of these different roles and responsibilities, and seeing all of them interact with each other, but also underneath all of those interactions having this espionage subplot going on, like, one of us is a traitor. Who's the traitor? This is the most obvious person, but it can't be that person for obvious reasons, so it must be this person. It's the only person it could possibly be.
Yeah, treachery within treachery.
But it's not that one. Yeah. Seeing all of that kind of cloak and dagger play out underneath this very sincere and earnest, not even a veneer, but just like a foundation that this family has that's now being kind of put into question with each other because of the circumstances they find themselves in.
Yeah, and I think that we'll pick up on that conversation a little bit in the themes. Religion and control and power and suffering to get things done. Even Leto, the good guy, right, has to do some questionable things. And to get things done, I don't mean like, conquer Arrakis or fix a tire, but to get things done as in to survive and to, manure these waters he finds himself in.
Right. And so, yeah, it was all of the family dynamics of the Atreides that really struck me. And the reason why, when Jonathan said that you were reading this book for your podcast and you wanted me to come on, I was trying to think of, well, how can I offer something different or unique? And I'd not actually read the serials. And that's why I was like, well, I'll start reading through the story again to refamiliarize myself with it. And seeing some subtle differences in the writing It's basically like 90%, 99% the same. And what I assume are just editorial choices, making some small changes throughout, I thought was also rather interesting. So it's like being able to see an earlier draft of what has become the official draft, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. Changing gears a little bit, let's talk about how the book came to be. So for me, this is very interesting. So I've listened to a few Frank Herbert interviews to get these tidbits, and the genesis of the book can be traced back to an article that Frank Herbert wanted to write or needed to write. So he was an ecologist, a lecturer. He wrote a lot of journal articles for peer-reviewed journals, and he came across a pilot project by the U.S. Forest Service in Oregon, where they were successfully managed the flow of sand dunes to prevent them from blocking highways. And his fascinations with the mechanics of the sand dunes and fluid dynamics and all those scientific stuff, right? That just fascinated him, that captivated him. So he started to accumulate vast amount of data for this article. And as he's writing this thing, he's like, oh, wow, this could be a story. But I have too much material for an article and too much material for a short story. So he began to build this world that we know is, Dune, and researched religions and went out of his way to find ideas elsewhere to pull in and create the world that, well, all four of us have, read and love. So I don't know. That's just a tidbit that really I thought was interesting. And him being, an amateur historian, how interesting it is for artists to find their muse, right? Something can come from left field and can be created into a thing, a book, a movie that captivates such a wide audience.
Yeah, I found the desert world really interesting. I had no idea that Herbert was inspired by this sand dune project. I do find it interesting how sand dunes move. There's some sand dunes here in Michigan, a place called Silver Lake, and went there as a kid and then went there as an adult. And to see how much that changed in just the span of like 20 years was just incredible. So I can see why Herbert would be fascinated by how sand dunes move and migrate.
What about you, Jonathan, and then Chris, since you both are of an artistic type? You've tried to write a book. Talk to that, like the genesis of artistic projects, how seemingly they can come about in such a weird way.
The way that you discover worlds like this, and I say discover because I think oftentimes it's less creating and more curiosity that drives you, where you start with a question like Herbert had, where what would it be like if there was a world that was basically just one big dune? And then he started asking questions, and he said, well, that would mean that there's not a lot of water. And I'm just like kind of riffing off here, but you start with a single idea staked in the ground, and then you build the logical framework from that point. Like, well, if it's a dune world, then there's a lack of water. If there's a lack of water, that means that people living on there have a high price of water, and they value it, but they need water to survive. And it's just like this logical thread that starts when you begin creating, and it starts with a stake in the ground. I recently had a thought, literally on my walk this morning, about an idea that I might toy with, where what would it be like if you had some powerful being who was tied to a specific geographical location that they could never leave for longer than, call it a week. But they had to do items where they had to go to other parts of the world. This is just like a thought that I had, a creative thought I had this morning, where it's like, okay, you create a moment in time, a character, a space, and then the parameters around why there's a limitation, and then your story just kind of blossoms from that. So that would be my thoughts on how you can create something so loved by people by taking a single stake in the ground and then addressing the unfolding logically of like, well, what would it mean if this place was a big dune? Chris, what do you think?
One thing I think is interesting going to Dune in particular is that being science fiction, one of the things he'd use to build out that logical framework that everything else stems off of is his interest and understanding of ecology, which I know, Slava, you've spoken up about several times in previous episodes. And this is something that I think a lot of older science fiction did that we don't see very often in newer science fiction. Like when modern science fiction is, to put simply, has a lot more in common with the action of Star Wars rather than going to some deeper, just like, what if X? Well, if X, then everything else unravels from that. It's like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, building out the entire universe off of just a simple cake or muffin or something like that. And so having that sort of foundation of the understanding of an environment, everything that surrounds the environment, how things interact each other, but not just the environment in a nature sense, but environment as in a tribe, a culture, and how all of those interact with each other. And having that be the foundation that he kind of builds all of this story out of. There's a billion places you go with it, and he goes quite a few billion places, it seems.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if that connected to what you were saying, Jonathan.
I think it did.
Yeah, no, that works. That's good.
The question in general felt an awful lot like a where do you get your ideas from?
Yeah, tell me your secrets.
Question.
I didn't mean it that way.
Slava needs new book ideas.
What I was trying to ask, I guess, at the crux of it is how weird it is. This thing that Herbert created came from an article he was supposed to write, and he never pretended to be an author. He did read a lot of sci-fi for the 5 years that leading up to this, and then he's like, "Well, I think I got a story here. Let me try my hand at it." And he's talented enough to do that the way he did, but whether you're less talented or more talented than him as a creative, it's just interesting where ideas pop out of. I've seen many behind the scenes documentaries of movies and DVD commentaries on the movies. When an actor or a director gives you a little bit of insight as to where he got the idea, it always strikes me as interesting.
That's interesting. That sparks an idea in my mind that I want to ask as a question to us. While you were reading the book, were there any quotes or like moments that, Herbert wrote that really stood out to you or drew your attention or sparked your own creative idea from that? Spencer?
One quote that I really liked, and I think it comes from later in the book when Paul is head of the Fremen. He says, it's as easy to be overwhelmed by giving as it is by taking. I don't really know how to elaborate very well on this, but I think sometimes we can focus, like there's got to be a good balance of giving and taking in your own personal life. I think if you constantly give and give and give, eventually there's nothing left to give, and then you just get burnt out. But in the opposite sense, in the case of the Harkonnens, they take and take and take, and eventually there's nothing left to take, and then the people revolt against the Harkonnens there. There's just got to be a good balance of power and giving and taking, I guess. I think that's something that kind of stood out to me near the end of the book when I heard that quote by Paul.
What about you, Slava?
There's two that kind of stood out to me. One of them was, I think, from the epigraphs from Princess Erlon. It's once men turned their thinking over to machines, the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. And in my head, that sparked a couple of thoughts, particularly man's attachments to technology, right? AI and stuff like that. And I'm not making any kind of statements about the value or the good or the bad of AI. They're just certain people, and I would say vast parts of society, are attached to the technology that we have. And me too. I'm addicted to my phone. I'm attached to this thing because everything's in here, right? So in the book, what I got out of it, the outlawing of machines that think didn't stop progress in this world, right? They have shields, they have flying, not saucers, but they have machines that take them from, planet to planet. They have flying machines. They're able to space travel. And they do have communication devices. And take the Bene Gesserits, for example. They have advanced in their human abilities. And they want to continue to advance the rest of the humans in this universe. It did stop me for a few minutes, and I was thinking like, oh, yeah, people are attached to technology. And if misused, it will have detrimental effects personally on you, even like the doom scrolling. Yeah, it's nice to be able to sit for half an hour and just unplug and do something that doesn't require a lot of thinking and just relax. But if you're 3 hours into, TikTok scrolling, that's probably bad for you. As a simple example, like obviously Herbert is talking about more important things when he's saying that. So that's one that stood out. And one thing that I have to keep telling myself all the time is when Halleck says, what's mood got to do with it? You fight when the necessity arises, no matter the mood. Mood is a thing for cattle or making love or playing Balisset. It's not for fighting. And I know for me, sometimes I'm just like, oh gosh, everything sucks. I don't want to do anything. And I'm just going to go and sit and play Diablo for 4 hours. Then I get to no, Slava, you're a 40-year-old man. Finish your work.
Be an
and
adult.
This is, again, another simple example. We can get into more adult examples or more, real life examples, I suppose. But this is just a simple example. Like, no, finish your stupid job. And then at 5 p.m., you can get in Diablo for a little bit and just be an adult about it.
This is a theme that's reoccurred through other characters as well in different ways. There's a point in the story where Jessica's quoting or remembering a saying, I think it was either in the OC Bible or in the pseudo-religious instruction manual they got in their Frem kit when they first find themselves out in the desert all alone. And it was she said something like there's a time for mourning and a time for there's a time for this, there's a time for that. I don't remember the exact wording of it. But another spot where it came up was with some of the Fremen. I believe Stilgar may have said something along these lines at some point in time, and also whatever the Fremen was that Thufir Hawat was taking refuge in during the giant siege of Erechine in the in the cliffside of a cave or something. They said we will do fighting when there's the time of fighting, or I don't remember the exact wording, but there's this idea of like there's a time and a place for certain things, and you do the thing when it's the time for this thing, and not when it's this other thing. Maybe one of the more striking ones was that you allow the baby to do all of its crying while it's a baby because water's precious. It needs to get all of its crying out now because it's not allowed to cry when it's older.
Yeah.
It's this sense of responsibility that's spoken about from Herbert's writing that I think is a stark contrast to how the world exists today, where this phrase that Slava quoted was, what's the mood have to do with it? It's like, doesn't matter how you feel right now. You have to do a thing. If you're in the middle of a fight, you fight. If you're in the middle of, making love, you make love. If you're in the middle of planning for the future, you plan for the future. And I think that it's a stark contrast, and it's a good not conduit. It's a good vehicle to use, is like this royal family, this ducal heir, to go, hey, it doesn't matter how you feel. You have a job to do. You have a duty. You have a responsibility. And I think anytime that comes out today, it is a very stark contrast because society tells us, just do what you feel, be happy, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, there's a time to do things. Like, Slava, you just said, like, there's a time to do your job. Do your job. Do it well. Do it with excellence. Like, and then you can do whatever you want. But, like, these are the hours for discipline, responsibility, and duty.
Yeah, and that translates into bigger things. I used a somewhat of a mundane example, but that translates into, taking care of your family, going to college, dealing with sickness, anything that applies to a lot of things in life, not just, Slava wanting to play video games an hour early, although that's also a good exercise in discipline, right?
Chris, were there any other like quotes that stood out to you during the reading?
Well, there were a few that were mostly standing out because of how they differed ever so slightly from the analog magazine version to the novel version. But rather than necessarily go through and nitpick on all of these, a couple of things that maybe more stood out was kind of tying into some of the foreshadowing that I've only noticed because this is, I don't know, maybe the dozenth time I've read this, is when the Duke Leto tells Paul that, he gives him the choice of like, do you wish to become a Mentat? Do you want to continue the training? The very end of that scene, there's a brief moment where something's hinted at, and then they use the word terrible purpose. And I wanted to read this paragraph here, see if you might pick up on something they say here. You'll be the Duke someday, son, the Duke said. A Mentat Duke would be formidable indeed. Can you decide now, or you wished more time? There was no hesitation in his answer. I'll continue the training. Formidable indeed, the Duke murmured, and Paul saw the proud smile on his father's face. The smile shocked Paul. It had a skull look to it. He closed his eyes, feeling an awakening of the terrible purpose within himself. Perhaps being a Mentat is terrible purpose, he thought. But even as he thought this, his new awareness denied it. And I don't know if something jumped out to you when you were reading that, or heard me say that, but when I was reading this, what jumped out to me is that way further in the story, there's a time skip. And during the part after the time skip where Herbert writes this sort of Paul looking into the past and trying to remember, oh, am I here? Am I in the future? Am I in the past? What's going on? Something that's mentioned briefly in passing is that they went to Arakeen to recover his father's body. And another saying that has come up is the shrine of his father's skull, that there'd be fanatical legions destroying the entire known universe, flying the flag of the shrine of his father's skull. And I don't know if Herbert intended to use this point as kind of a piece of foreshadowing for that, but when I read that this time through, it just immediately jumped out at me as like, ugh. I'm just imagining you kind of having this proud, heartfelt moment of like, my father is proud of me for something, but then all of a sudden having this weird foreboding that he can't necessarily understand because he hasn't had contact with the spice yet. His awareness hasn't fully blown up into this terrible purpose that he keeps feeling and can't necessarily describe until he realizes, oh, I need to save humanity. Things are going really bad, but oh no, there's going to be, if I gain this power, all this terrible stuff's going to happen.
Right. I only picked up on that when I read your notes that you dropped into our episode matrix. I was like, there it is. But before that, and I only read this book once, right? And listened to it an audiobook, actually. So I didn't pick up on it my first read through, but that's an awesome thing to point out. I think Herbert did that on purpose because everything else that he's done, even with the epigraphs, and even making Princess Irulan the author of the epigraphs, was a nice. I don't want to call it a twist, but what's a notch less than a twist, right?
It's a sudden surprise reveal, and it changes the context of all of the epigraphs when you realize that she is the daughter of the emperor who becomes Paul's wife at the end of the story.
Untouched and unloved wife.
What a life to live.
Well, even the way Frank put the words in Jessica's mouth, where she's like, "I hear that she likes to write. I hope there'll be a consolation for her."
Woof.
Yeah. I'm actually curious what you thought about the way that the story ended in the novel, because I have mixed feelings of where I think it's simultaneously perfect and strangely unfulfilling at the same time.
Yes. I feel the same way. I would probably articulate it differently than you, but I like sometimes when there's a mystery, I like that it ends with Paul winning. The last two chapters, specifically the last one, I was like, finally, the good guys, are winning, right? That thing that you get at the end of the movie where the guy finally defeats all his enemies, and Paul does. And just Paul's freaking, the balls on him at the end of the last chapter. Like he puts everybody in their place, right? So that was strangely satisfying. Maybe not that strangely, but that was satisfying. Then it ends, and you're like, all right, he won, and it ends, and I know there's a sequel. There's a trilogy, so we'll probably pick up. So I'm not that disappointed. But at the same time, and I mentioned this in a previous episode, I was like, no epilogue? Not even like 5 pages on what Paul did next for maybe a year or two? No Cheney adventures? Cheney doesn't stab anybody else in the face? I wanted a little bit of something, and then it would have been perfect for me. So that was my takeaway.
Well, there's a whole other book that is an epilogue.
So,
Right.
it's a book-a-log.
That may be part of the reason why there is no epilogue.
Fair enough. Yep.
What about you, Spencer? What do you think about the ending?
Yeah, I thought it was kind of abrupt. We see this final, fight between Paul. I'm not gonna lie, I don't remember who he fought at the end.
Fade Rotha.
That's right. We see that fight, and then all of a sudden he's just like Paul standing up to the Emperor. I guess to me it just felt kind of abrupt from the whole book. Paul, the Atreides family dealing with the fallout of the Harkonnen betrayal or whatever you want to call that, and then just them. Paul and his mom in the desert, meeting up with the Fremen, getting involved with them, becoming their leader. And then all of a sudden it was just like, that was like 95% of the book. And then all of a sudden the last, like you said, 2 chapters was the final fight and then him standing up to the Emperor. And so I guess I personally would have liked a little bit more of how that all like transpired, like how we got there. Yeah, and it did feel... Yeah, the revelation that Irulan was the Emperor's daughter and then becomes Paul's wife, I guess, or whatever.
It's a political alliance wife.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was a cool, like, revelation, like you were saying. But, yeah, it was just like, oh, okay, I thought we were going to get a little bit more on that. Yeah, overall, I mean, thought it was very good. Good ending, but just abrupt.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I was like, why is the Emperor, and Slava and I talked about this in the last episode briefly. It's like, how does the Emperor come to a planet and then not have like backup plans? And then also, and this is a question that is not answered, at least in this book, what's the deal with the guild? Like, what do they really want? I mean, they've got all this money, they're funding all these wars, but like, they don't have a way out either. It was good. It was a nice like, hey, I'm going to wrap it up. But it did seem rushed. Like, what lured the Emperor into Arrakis that he was like, I need to go and deal with this? Like, it just didn't seem satisfactory to me. That was like, you've got people for that. Go deal with it. Like, send them to deal with it.
What do you think, Chris? You look like you have something to say.
I'm trying to remember how it went exactly. As to why the guild was involved in general, they want the spice production to continue because they're reliant on it for space travel, and everybody is as well. One other aspect is that anyone who's basically come into contact with the spice for some undefined amount of time, they become dependent on it to just live. I don't believe they say exactly how long it takes for this to occur, but anyone who's had it for some amount, you need to keep having the spice in your diet or you die. And I don't know if that's related into the Emperor's reasons at all, but I believe he knew, like, word was coming out that it was Paul who was leading the uprising, who was on Arrakis. He didn't want it to become known that the Emperor did what he did, that he sided against a specific house and had them obliterated. And that gets into the whole tripod of how the society is structured, and there being a Landsrod to offset the power of the Emperor, there being the Spacing Guild, which is dependent on the spice, and everyone's dependent on each other in some way.
Yeah, the Emperor says something to Baron Harkonnen where he said, I'm going to paraphrase, but, didn't you know that Muad'Dib is, Paul Atreides? And he's like, no, he's not. And so the Emperor reveals that he did gather this information, but it just felt like, oh, hey, here's a suddenly, And then in terms of the guild and the space travel, I guess, and this has been my complaint on other books and other things, but the point didn't seem to hit home. It was like, oh, I think it's mentioned once, maybe twice, if that. Both the you need spice to continue living and the hey, spice is required for space travel. And so I think that unless you're really great at catching every detail on a first read, like this is my second read and I didn't remember that. So yeah.
So there's actually one thing I wanted to actually talk about, and it's related to Dr. Yui, and this may also in some sense tie into some of the subtle differences with the analog serial and the novelized version. Is after Yui betrays the Duke when I was reading through this, there was something that he said, and the fact that this, I believe, was edited out from the magazine version into the novel, I find rather interesting because it kind of goes a little bit more into Yui's reason for why he was doing that, or how he justifies it to himself. So after the Duke is unconscious and he's making a promise that he's going to save his wife or his concubine and his son, there's one paragraph that I don't remember reading ever before. And Yui says to the Duke, "Too much is concentrated against you, Duke Leto. You must believe it. Most of the Chone Company directors resent your inclusion amongst them. The Emperor does not permit possible rivals to live, and the great houses who resent your easy ways. You weren't wise to refuse marital alliance, you know." And I don't think that paragraph exists in the novel. And I thought it was interesting because earlier in the book, they go into why the Duke is not married, because it leaves the option open, and yet leaves the option open for alliances between all of these different families. And I just thought that was an interesting thing that I'd noticed that got edited out, and what that sort of implication might mean. But I don't know what I think about that. It just stood out to me as really, really strange and interesting.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up, is what was it about that being cut that stuck out to you? I know why it stuck out to me, because first off, I didn't know it was there. But because you caught it, I'm curious. Attempt to unpack that a little bit.
Well, I guess, why is Yui doing what he's doing? I don't believe they say how long he's been married to his wife, but he's an old person, so I'd imagine it must be for quite a while. And based on the dialogue exchange between Jessica and Yui, I have to assume that she was captured by the Harkonnens before he even came into the employ of the Atreides family. So it's a very interesting situation, because when I was first younger and was going through the story, Yui didn't make any sense to me at all as a character in any of the adaptations or even the original novel. But growing older, I find myself sympathizing with him a lot more. If you were in his situation, what would you do if these horrible people had your wife captive? You didn't know if she was alive or dead. You didn't know what kind of pain and torture they were putting her under. What would you do?
Right. I found him sympathetic too. And if you listen to the previous episodes, which you did, maybe you noticed that I said, I'm surprised that I found him sympathetic, because I wouldn't have found the traitor sympathetic in any other context. So Herbert did a good job here. And why I found him sympathetic is because, these guys have his wife, and he doesn't know if he could trust the Duke, right? If the Duke was as close to him as he is to some of his other, guards, maybe Yui can come and say, "Hey, Duke, crap just hit the fan. They took my wife." But it seems, and it's something interesting that you just mentioned just seconds ago, is when did he come into the employ of the House of Atreides? Was the wife gone before that? Was she gone during that, after that? Because he's told everybody that she was killed. And she was, right? But so is that him lying? Or is that him just telling the truth, knowing that she's dead anyway? And is his betrayal of the Duke, in his mind, the only way he can get close to the Emperor to exact revenge, which kind of is hinted at in the book, and then he fails because the Baron's Mentat murders him. So there's a lot of intrigue there, right?
Yeah, if we assume everything Yui is saying is true, then what I've understood is that he doesn't know that if his wife is alive or dead. And I believe there was a line somewhere that was written that, when he was meeting with the Baron about how the fact that he had gone under the same torture devices only briefly, like knowing what kind of pain his wife must be going on, was how they broke his conditioning to allow him to basically run this sort of a traitorous scheme. Then what he concocts is basically his plan is that he needs to stand in front of the Baron himself to know whether or not his wife is alive or dead. And he can tell just by the way the Baron is acting. the way he's carrying himself, the way he's talking to him and addressing him, he knows, like, okay, he has no hold over me. He has no power over me to do anything. That means my wife is dead. That's what I find kind of strange, that he's doing it because he needs to know that she's dead. Like, he didn't really, what I understood is he didn't really have any idea or hopes of that they would both be leaving it alive. Or maybe I'm reading into something that wasn't there, and I'm thinking about that with hindsight, but that's what it struck to me, and that makes it slightly more complicated too.
Yeah, for sure. Spence, what about you? You've been quiet for a while. What are your thoughts on this Yui situation?
I too found him sympathetic. I found myself liking Dr. Yui in spite of his betrayal of the Atreides. He just found himself in a tough situation. I try to put myself in that situation. Like, what would I do if I found myself there? I'm not married, so I don't really know, but I feel like I would want to do everything in my power to protect my wife. But then again, at the expense of betraying or killing, in this instance, someone who you've worked for, someone like you're probably pretty close with, you've allied yourself with, good friends. That's just such a tough situation. And I don't know if I really know what I would do until I was put into that kind of a situation. I'd like to think I would, like, what is the right thing to do in that situation? Do you protect your wife, or do you continue to protect your friends and the family that you're working for, like the good guys, I guess, if you want to call it that in this instance? You know how ruthless the Harkonnens are. So do you continue to ally yourself with the Atreides, or do you actually just try to protect your wife? Like, what is the ultimate good or right thing to do in that situation? I guess I don't really know.
Right, and I'll add some complexity to that. Even if you know that, all right, no matter what I do, wife is dead. But if I betray the Duke, she's dead quickly. If I don't betray the Duke, Baron, with his proclivities, might do something even horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pure speculation now. We're outside of Herbert's world. That's my, what goes on in Slava's brain. But moving on from this topic, but speaking about sympathetic characters, what character did you like the best? Did you like the worst? Identify with? It's kind of a three-part question. Let's keep it going with you, Spencer, and then Chris.
Not gonna lie, I don't know if there was a character that I felt like I really resonated with. I guess a character maybe that I liked the most. I found it's hard because we don't see this character hardly at all, but Paul's little sister, because of how she was transformed, I guess, in the womb, and then when she was born as like a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, I mean, she's already speaking on the level of like a 13, 14-year-old. It was just like a super, super interesting character. She was incredibly smart, and the way she was able to manipulate, I think it was the Baron. She told the Baron, like, yeah, I allowed you to capture me. I thought that was
Bold words.
Yeah. I thought that was really great.
Grandfather?
Yeah. And I don't even know if the Baron caught that. Herbert makes no reference to the Baron recognizing that or anything. But yeah, she was just, I feel like it would be fun to see more of her in the story, and maybe I don't know if she is in the future in the other books, but to me she was a fun character that I would like to see more of. I found her intriguing.
The Baron couldn't hear her over his jowls jiggling.
Yeah,
that's a thing, isn't it? What about you, Chris?
Well, staying on the topic of Aaliyah for a brief moment, one of the things I find interesting about her as a character is, not the conception. We don't see that in the book. What's the ceremony?
That's not in the serial edition?
They allude to it happening some 2 weeks prior to the events of the story, but
the Duke approaches
the
Jessica.
ceremony, the ritual,
when she becomes the mother.
Ramallo, when Jessica and Ramallo have the way that scene is written, about just like being in this empty black gray void and there just being this spark of light, and then there's the two of them, and then they realize, oh, there's this third spark of light. The purely like emotional writing of that scene, coupled with much later in the story hearing Aaliyah recount that, I find I can't necessarily put my thumb on what it is about those two scenes that I find really touching, but there's something about how he wrote those that really I just like it. I can't really describe why. It's on a purely emotional level. It's nothing necessarily like cool or awesome. It's just there's something there that I really liked a lot. But the character that I don't know if I necessarily identified with any of these characters or found myself personally attached or related or like I am this character. But in terms of characters that I thought were really, really cool, I think the top of the list for me is Thufir Hawat, the Mentat for the Atreides and the Duke's Master of Assassins. And what I think I necessarily found cool about him may just be stuff I made up in my own head that's not actually a part of the story, but just like little hints and bits that are maybe alluded to about him as a person, what his skill set is, because we see pieces of it in that confrontation between Thufir and Jessica, but also just the way he's this old man that served this one family for 3 generations, and he's just a really cool character. When you seen him interact, he interacts with the Fremen, and they have a nice interaction there before he's captured, and then when he's captured and working for the Duke, he's still in his mind kind of plotting like, Paul's still alive. I can kind of work things from this back end here to get things going. And even though he thinks that he's also tied with like, he's so dead set that Jessica is the traitor.
Yeah.
He's a flawed character, but super awesome.
I feel like, Chris, you have this appreciation of the older guide, the older Gandalf type, the older Oracle's too strong of a word, because I'm thinking about Orev right now, which is a character from our book who's this old, grizzled military guy who's retired. He lost his whole family. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember you really loving him as a character and going, oh yeah, this guy's got something to share. And I think it's just like a call from your preferences where it's like appreciating old wisdom that's grizzled and it's just like, so.
Well, I think you might be right. I mean, in some sense, Paul doesn't have friends, but he has 4 dads essentially growing up, and Thufir's the granddad in terms of age and life experience, I suppose.
That's a good recognition.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I was just going to ask you if you had like a favorite character or someone that you resonated with in the story.
Yeah, Spencer, that's a great question. I'd say that I identify with Paul the most, and I only say that because, and I've talked about this a little bit here and there on the podcast about like having a birth defect, but like this idea of a terrible purpose where like fate and destiny, and it's entirely possible that if you're a psychologist and you're listening to this and you're like trying to assess who I am as a person, that I've attached myself to a narrative that is, born under a specific star line and, I have a great calling over my life. And that's fine. I accept that. No problem being
Did you say psychologist or astrologist? Because I heard psychologist, and I'm like, this one, what psychologist is into astrology?
Well, the psychology part of it would be that I've attached myself to a narrative of like destiny and fate.
Right. Okay.
That's the connection there. Fair point. But I purposefully quoted the stars thing because, like, if you ever played Elder Scrolls or Oblivion or any of those type of big tier Bethesda games, you get to choose a star sign that you're born under, which gives you stats. It's this call out to destiny. It's this call out to fate, right? Like, and so part of my attachment with a Paul type character is like, to give meaning, and I've quoted Jung before, but like to give meaning to suffering. And I don't think that that's exactly what Paul's doing, but I think that it's something that you could assert is partly happening because he lives in the tension of like, is this destiny and fate of me being called to be the Messiah, or is this? And I also just realized I should pause and say I don't believe myself to be a Messiah, but I have thought about starting a cult because it pays well. I won't because I don't think it's ethical, but it has crossed my mind if I'm going to be transparent with the audience. So that would be the person that I resonate with, for better or worse, before I get locked up for thinking myself a leader of a Messiah cult thing.
For me, this has been par for the course with books that Jonathan has suggested. And this one, we both kind of said, hey, we should do this because Dune's coming out now, 2024. So screwed up our marketing campaign. but I've identified with a few female characters in the books that Jonathan suggested, and they were all Sanderson books. Here, I didn't identify with any character, not even the female character, but Cheney stood out as a very interesting person to me. And for me, when she kills the guy that comes to challenge Paul, and Paul's all butthurt about it, and she's like, "Hey, don't worry about it. Go do Duke stuff. Now anybody that comes to challenge you knows that your girlfriend will kill them." And I was like, "That's my girl. I like that. I really like that." And I can say that unabashedly without any, complex, I guess is the word. Because I have a wife like that. She's a really cool partner to me, and she might stab you if you come after me. She still has flaws. She has things that she's going through. She's definitely very feminine, but she's not a fainting, a shrinking violet, or, she's not clutching her pearls and fainting every time. But this gives us a chance to jump into maybe one of the themes, and I don't know if we'll do them in order as in the document here, but people in nature, how are talked about, ecology, right? There's the actual scientific part of ecology in the book, terraforming the planet, and how Paul says, how Dune shows how you can be changed by the environment while trying to change that itself. You'll be always affected by the environment. There's even a quote that I also like that I mentioned earlier was, "God created Arrakis to make men stronger." I'm paraphrasing, but let's dive into that for a little bit. Like, Cheney is as the jumping off point. This kid who grew up in the desert. I'm sure if you take any girl the same age from the planet the Atreides are from, I forget the name, she probably have Kaladin, less impetus to stab anybody, right, for anything.
I would say it's kind of an everlasting conversation of nature versus nurture, even more so when you have an environment, because you have to, I think in every book, everywhere, and every person that's ever lived, there is an innate level of, I need to survive. There's a survival mechanism that exists. And so if you're on a harsh planet like Arrakis, then you will either adapt or die. Those are your options. There is no, as far as I know, there's no third option. Feel free to jump in on that, but you don't have the joys of comfort when you live in a harsh environment. You go, well, this is just the way that it is. It's like when you bring someone from a third world country to America and they're like, whoa, what is going on? We see this played out in storylines sometimes that, like when we were kids, of I forget the name of the movie, but it's like a knight from the past is brought to the present day. And he's like, what is this witchcraft device that's speaking to me on a wall? And he's experiencing the 21st century from the knowledge of the past. And instead of understanding it, he is using his current framework of the environment that he grew up in and going, if it's something that I don't understand, it's witchcraft. Right? And so he is bringing his present circumstance. And this is why it's interesting to follow Paul and his family, the Atreides, when they come over to Arrakis, because they're like, well, we've been part of the nobility. We've been in a place that has water forever. And so it's just a stark change for them to come to a place that has never seen that before and then have to adapt or die. Rip Duke Atreides. But I think that we all have in our lives different challenges that we have to deal with, be them environmental or just the fate that is handed to us. I've just mentioned this a little bit ago. It's like I was born with a birth defect, and that's just something that I have to embrace and deal with and watch in specific ways that has turned me into the person that I am. And I was actually having a conversation with, you can call it meditation or prayer, but God last night, about my own state of being, because I have to constantly watch my health, and little changes for me, like sweating is part of the reason I have kidney stones. That's just the way that my body works. And so the environment that my person has to endure in this body that I've been given requires me to make specific choices and changes to survive. And then by surviving, I have to next choose this idea of, well, how am I going to categorize and embrace the suffering that I've been given and then use that as a formation of the personality that I have and how I want to experience the world. So I don't know if that really answers your question entirely, but I think that it is an inescapable thing to juggle the tension between nature versus nurture, both environmentally and in your personhood, is we as this like lump, this brain that's just like pulsating electricity gets to control this human meat bag to make choices that are so deeply philosophical, it's mind-boggling, pun intended. Those are a lot of words. Someone help me.
Sorry.
Chris, you should say that. Say it.
So basically, God gave Jonathan birth defects to make him faithful.
Muad'Dib,
probably.
probably.
Yeah, probably.
Like it. Spencer, what do you think?
If I can remember going back to Slava asking about people in nature, ecology, man versus environment, that kind of thing. I find it fascinating that the Fremen are, I think it was Dr. Kynes, when he was having his moment in the desert right before he died, he was just remembering all the things that his father was talking to him about. And one of the things was how they are invested in making Arrakis a livable place. Essentially, I think, the idea of kind of terraforming. But they, and he was saying like, yeah, we're not like, our children won't see it, our children's children won't see it, our grandchildren's children probably won't even see it. But yet they were fighting for this chance to make the world a place that their future generations could call home and be a livable place and not have to worry about water. And it was just fascinating to see the care and attention that they gave to their environment. And then you have someone like the Harkonnens who are there just to abuse the planet and take the resources and use it for personal gain. And it was just fascinating to see the contrast between the Fremen and the Harkonnen, and then how maybe Paul would kind of maybe bridge the gap there, and how he might work to help the Fremen achieve their goals. Part of me wonders if Herbert, when he was writing that, if he was cautioning us, in our world to just kind of take care of the planet, our resources, how we might invest in future generations versus just looking out for ourselves in the now. So that's one thing that kind of stood out to me as well in this section, in this kind of idea of taking care of our environment.
Kynes is I do think Kynes is a rather interesting character. And that scene where he's kind of having that hallucination of a memory or non-existent. I don't know if it's a memory or a non-existent conversation, but he's talking to his father who's dead. And on a brief aside, there's that one line where it says, "Why aren't you helping? Or why won't you shut up? Can't you see I'm dying?" I think
Yep.
that line just thrown into the middle of it there. But what I thought was interesting with that particular chapter is we essentially see that Kynes and his father, and it's been a while since I read the appropriate appendice. I think maybe even his grandfather, all essentially had the plan of doing what Paul essentially comes in and does and co-ops for himself, essentially. And so Kynes and his forefathers have essentially laid the groundwork in a religious sense of incorporating like the people's religion into them caring for the planet and giving them a vision and a hope and a dream of like this hell, for lack of a better way, can be made into heaven by, generations and generations and generations of investment into the future.
This is from my notes. This is me extrapolating it out of the text. Kynes was in it for the long run. And you mentioned this in some of your notes, Spencer, that the Fremen are in it for the long run, right?
Yep.
And so Kynes was using the religion, and maybe this is a good way into transitioning it into religion and control. Kynes was using the Fremen religion to instill in them, if you will, a fervor or a desire or a commitment or all three to do this thing, which is terraforming the planet for the next how many generations, right? And even one of the Fremen says that our grandchildren might not see this, but maybe their great-great-grandchildren will see it. So Kynes was all about using the worldview, the religion of the Fremen, their commitment to the planet, their makeup, to use all that to transform the planet.
It reminds me of something that Yui said in the conversation with Jessica, and it's just a simple question. Are you sure that the soil is hostile and that this family's been uprooted and planted here? And it seems in so many ways like the fervor and forward vision that Kynes gave has, in a sense, planted Paul into actually very fertile soil, despite it being a barren desert.
So I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I think that speaks closely to this quote that I had thought about earlier from the book, where Moadib says, there should be a science of discontentment. People need hard times to develop psychic muscles. And when you talk about being planted in an environment that is really fertile soil, I think that makes us, well, how do I want to say this? I think that that's true for everyone. I think that we watch inspirational videos online of people who overcome suffering in a way that is inspiring. And we all have the power and potential of free will to tap into and use and assert against the environment that we're put in to really find a way to flourish, regardless of birth defects or bad parenting or abusive, toxic upbringings or whatever. Like, we really get to affect the environment that we are put into, and we do have the power to change the world if we simply will embrace the suck and embrace the suffering of the Arrakis that is our lives. Whatever your flavor is, doesn't have to be a dune, a desert planet, but I think that does play into using what's in front of you. And for Paul, it was religion and control. He tapped into this thing. He felt the fate, and he took the cards that he was dealt, and he went, well, I'm in this situation. My father's dead. We're on the run, and I think I can use this piece in front of me to become what I need to become. And I don't think he was ever really convinced on before the time jump. And I think I would probably assert that during the time jump, he kind of came to a realization like, no, I guess I am the Messiah figure, which I think would be interesting to unpack a little more from his character's point of view in this time jump. Regardless, he took what was in front of him, which was a religion of these people. And I think, was it Kynes who said, like, this religion existed before they ever arrived? And so he was kind of like postulating that it was commandeered by the Bene Gesserit, right? Is that covered in the book somewhere? I'm remembering.
I don't recall Kynes ever saying anything like that specifically, but I know that is
somebody said
something that's kind of hinted at, I think, in the story, is that the thousands of years ago, the Bene Gesserit sort of like implanted some legends into and kind of basically, perverted, corrupted, skewed, put a little bit of a left turn into what would have been the progression of that religion. And so probably some combination of the two. I know Jessica particularly picked up on the manipulator of religions, having been there on Arrakis and having done work there.
Yeah, and then they found a way to assimilate that religion into working for them. But even more so, I think it posed questions where it's like, they had a Reverend Mother before the Bene Gesserit showed up, from our understanding. And so it's like, you can affect the environment around you to a point, but it still will have deep roots in wherever it started from.
Yeah, that's right. Because we talked about this, Jonathan, where Paul is looking at this religion and saying, all right, I'm going to use it to these ends. And nothing in his character, at least to me, seems like he's exploiting these people. Maybe, I'm sure somebody can make an argument for it, but it seems that he's going, okay, I need to do this because I want to prevent the jihad. The way I prevent the jihad is by adopting this messiahship and leading these people. Jessica is looking at it going like, oh, wow, we're manipulating the crap out of these people, but we're also being affected, and I'm paraphrasing, but we're also being affected by this religion, because look at my son. He's embraced it. He is playing the role. So what I saw as interesting that's was recalibrated a little bit this morning when I was watching a Herbert interview and promoting his book. And this was like an interview from the 80s, I think, based on the video. Is he said something like this: leaders, especially charismatic ones, have the ability to amplify mistakes, and their decisions are often followed blindly by their followers. And this is what Paul is afraid of, right? Their blind adherence to authority can lead to the consolidation of power structures, which may eventually fall into the hands of corruptible individuals. And Herbert goes on to say, the old adage, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, is to be questioned. He even goes on to say that he doesn't believe it. Rather, he suggests that the power merely attracts those who are susceptible to corruption. And I think that right there is Baron Harkonnen, dude. Like, if he didn't have the power, he would just be a fat little rapey guy somewhere in a corner of,
He's not little. That's covered in the book. Didn't you hear how his jowls jiggled? And
well, his jowls would be jiggling somewhere in a less important place than the position he holds, right? And Sadler, I'm going to give a shout out to a guy because I always like to give YouTubers more views. I forget his first name, but it's Dr. Sadler. He's a professor of philosophy at Wisconsin. I forget which university. But he has a YouTube channel. It's fantastic. This is his assessment. One of the significant themes in Dune, he says, is religion, portraying it as a force that can empower or exploit. Some view religion as a means to manipulate the masses, Harkonnens probably, Bene Gesserits to a degree, while others see it as a way to find transcendent meaning in life. The interplay between religion, politics, and social structures creates a rich tapestry within the Dune universe, according to Dr. Sadler. So I that's one thing that really stood out to me too in this book, and that's why in the previous episodes you guys heard me keep coming back to this theme, because I think Herbert does it well. He's not foaming at the mouth saying all religion is the opiate for the masses and just shitting on religion, but he presents it as something that does help you interact with the transcendent things in this universe, but very adequately. He also presents how it can be abused in many ways, and the struggle that even the leaders who find themselves in these positions, the back and forth, I'm at a loss for words, the internal struggle, there you go, the internal struggle that they have while they're in that position.
Yeah, something that you said a minute ago, Slava, talking about how followers following blindly. I just happen to think of like our current political structure here in America, and I won't get onto either side, but I feel like I see it on both sides, where you just kind of have this Republican and Democrat, like followers following blindly, and just because they adhere to, like, I don't know, they somehow like find their identity in that, and so they refuse to like change, and it's just easier to follow something blindly, I think, than it is to do your own investigative research to kind of figure out where you stand on something. And change, people don't really like change, and so it's just easier to follow blindly sometimes. So when you're talking about people following blindly, that's just kind of like something that popped into my head. And that's a political structure, not necessarily religious, as we maybe see on Arrakis with the Fremen and all that. But just I found that interesting.
But I think it's a worldview thing, and that you guys, if you listen to any of the episodes, you guys here in the audience, I keep mentioning it. It shapes the way you operate and view your world, view the world, and how you act within it. And not being able to articulate your own worldview will make you a sheeple, whether you're the Democrat sheep or the Republican sheep. And you know me, it pox on both your houses. But in order to land this plane, because we've been at it for an hour and a half, and I want to talk really, really quickly about fate versus free will, and then, we'll wind down and do a little, do something fun and end this episode. It seems that Paul can't escape this jihad, right? No matter what he does, he affects it in a little bit here and there, and he sees different futures. He even sees futures where he's dead. He sees futures where he's not dead, but then jihad is coming. So this interplay between fate and free will is very interesting. And I'm going to paraphrase Sadler again for this, and maybe we can do a minute each response to Sadler's quote here. The complex themes of Dune touch on existential concerns about relevance and purpose. Characters within the universe grapple with their roles, seeking meaning and significance in their actions. The decisions they make are influenced by power, ambition, their beliefs, and various religions, etc., etc. This exploration of purpose adds depth to the characters and emphasizes the human need for meaning and direction in life. And let's start with you, Chris. Then we'll work to Spencer, John, and then we'll close it out.
Decisions they make are influenced by power, ambition, and their beliefs in various religions. In a most general sense, I suppose I agree with pretty much everything that he says. In regards to in the context of fate versus free will, though, I suppose it's not necessarily a topic that I put much weight or stock into, because I guess I'm very much a pragmatist in a lot of sense. I guess that unless you can see the future, you don't know what it could be or what it will be. So it seems somewhat pointless to debate from my perspective. So my own worldview, I suppose, limits my own ability to engage with the subject.
I challenge that.
That makes sense.
No, I want to challenge that real quick. So you said you don't what the future could be, and I would say, well, the future could be whatever you make it, right? Like, which gets into the free will bit. It doesn't address fate at all, but
I think I see the way you're phrasing it now a bit better now. Yeah, I mean, you have the ability to do whatever it is you choose to do within your own means, and whatever those means are essentially something only you know. So, I mean, I guess maybe I was putting a lot of weight on the fate aspect of that, because now, in the sense of the science fiction world that Paul's in, he can see the future and he feels kind of bound to it, and he's tried to affect it, but he's still progressing towards that, and there's still like a greater end that is going to happen no matter what he does. He can make tiny twists. He can go with the flow, but he can't fight against it. I believe there was something that somebody had said. I think it was Thufir Hawat that had one of the first rules of Mentat is that you can't change the course of a thing. You have to join it and become a part of it in order to influence it. But even becoming a part of it and in trying to influence it, he's still kind of bound to the overall course that it's going. But again, this is a story. So maybe I'm missing something greater you're trying to allude to. I mean, I have my own ideas of what the future will bring, but if I start spouting all of them, people will think I'm a crazy psychopath, So there's, Jonathan might think he's Paul.
Well, you're in good
Muad'Dib,
company,
but
you're in good company. I'm trying to start a cult.
I mean,
so might as well just let it all out here.
Yeah. Well, to take what might say the coward's way out, but I don't think it is. I kind of am on both of your sides. I'm more of a pragmatist when it comes to this stuff, even as somebody who, believes in God and something outside of, let's call it the transcendental, right? The immaterial. I still think that your free will is bound by the context, the means, who you are as a person, right? All human beings will do what naturally comes to them, and they are free to act those things out. But to disagree with Jonathan, I don't think you can change the world or do whatever the hell you want. Here's my question. Let's end with this. Did Frank Herbert do a good job of exploring what Sadler says he does? Because Sadler's one guy. And yes, he's a literary guy and he's a philosopher, but Sadler's one guy. So he says that the whole fate versus free will theme in the book is Herbert exploring humans needing meaning and direction in life. Did you guys get that from when you were reading the book? Or is Sadler completely off base here? Or is he right and you're hearing it for the first time?
I didn't pick up on any of that specifically when I was reading it.
Yeah, neither did I. I thought it was interesting when I heard Sadler say it this morning when I was listening to it, so I put it in there as a question talking point. But I didn't either.
Yeah, I don't know if I really maybe the one character that I saw wrestle with it is Paul, just because he can see the future, and I feel like I see him wrestling with his own fate, especially when he sees the jihads under his name or his banner, and he's working to try to avoid that. But I guess I don't really see that with any of the other characters really wrestling with their fates or their free will versus fate idea.
Yeah, I agree with Spencer on this. The only one who really sticks out to me that wrestled between fate and free will would be Paul. I think that Jessica would be the secondary one because of being a Bene Gesserit. But I think that you could make an argument, albeit watered down, that the Duke understood there was kind of a fate at play, as well as his free will to choose to go to Arrakis instead of fight a war with the Emperor. But that said, I want to go back to something that Slava said, where it's like, you disagree with me, and I want to quote the great Gandalf here, that all we have to decide is to do with the time that is, all we have to do is to decide what to do with the time that is given to us. So yeah, you could get hit by a bus tomorrow, but I think that you even undercut yourself where it's like, well, it's your duty to try. You might not achieve it, and that's a different conversation, but it is your duty to try. But I think most of us are too busy being comfortable. I won't stand on this soapbox that I always stand on. It's the same soapbox. It just has different words because we're wrapping up here. I want to shift gears real quick because something that Chris said earlier when he was talking about the video games, why have they, and I want to pose this to you guys, I want to know what you think. Why have they not taken this intellectual property, this IP, Dune, and run with it? I mean, they're making the movie now, which is good. And previously, they ran with it, it sounds like, which was news to me. But it seems like it's not getting the love that other IPs get, like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Pokemon. And like, this IP has not really gotten a lot of attention since, when was the last movie out, Chris? The 60s or something like that? Or the 80s? The 80s? So it's been like 50 years.
Even the one before
40
the
years.
Villeneuve version coming now? Yeah, Frank Herbert, I want to say, was that 1987?
That sounds right. So, like, this thing sat dormant for 40, we'll call it 40 years. Just an untouched intellectual property that people know, respect, and love. And they just haven't done anything with it. Why?
I don't know if I have a good answer to this, but I just wonder if they don't want to maybe ruin it. So, like, with Sanderson, he's been in talks with, like, film companies or whatever, but he's super picky about wanting his stuff to be adapted well onto screen and making sure it's correct and right. I have no idea, but maybe that's one reason. Like whoever owns the Dune rights, maybe they are just maybe don't want it adapted any further than it's already been. I don't know. That's just my guess. I could be completely in left field for that, but
What do you think, Slav?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer either. I haven't watched the old Dune. I've seen clips of it. The graphics, I mean, everything ages poorly, right? But what I read about it was some of the graphics are so atrocious, even by 1987 standards, that David Lynch refuses to talk about this movie, right? He's like, nope, that didn't happen. I was drunk. I don't remember doing this movie. And so maybe that added to the time that's spent there. Like, we don't want to touch this because the people will think about that. Maybe it's the rights issue. So I don't have a good answer, but I'll tell you this. I watched the first movie and I was like, oh, wow, this is actually a decent movie. And then when I read the book, I was like, oh, the adaptation isn't that bad. Mm-hmm. It's actually a pretty decent adaptation. Now I'm looking forward to part 2. Why do you think? Did you find something online?
No, it just, like, these companies are always interested in making money. And I think that the thing that was asserted earlier from Spencer is like, well, maybe the person who owns the rights is just like not interested in giving it out. The thing is, though, the reason that Lord of the Rings was adapted for Magic cards right now, why Amazon is making a version of it, is because copyright law eventually dictates that if you don't use your intellectual property, it becomes public domain. And I'm paraphrasing, but these entities don't want to make their stuff become public domain, so they're like, they'll just produce garbage sometimes just so that it's being produced. So I'm just curious because this is something that could make them a lot of money even if they didn't follow the books at all. It's like, just take the story and run with it. Like, make it your own. So, just curious. Anyway.
I don't have a direct answer, but it's an assumption from what little I understand is that, so there are the original 6 books that Herbert wrote, and then I believe the rights were then transferred to his son, who has then, and I don't know how, I believe it's largely a rights thing. I don't know how derivative sequels kind of play into
Yeah, neither do I.
copyright ownership. But there have been continued prequels and sequels. I think there's 18, 19, 20. I don't know how many books have come out after Frank Herbert's worked on it. So there is work being done with the franchise itself. It's not in maybe the popular, easily mass-marketed, digestible mediums, though.
Got it. That makes sense.
If I may propose a soundbite, there are 1,000,001 things that could be discussed on just this novel alone in the franchise, and you could spend decades talking about so many minute details to the greater grand picture. So there are so many things that weren't discussed that could have been, but there's only so many hours in the day and so many minutes in a podcast.
I missed all that, Chris. Can you repeat that for me?
No.
Okay. Slava, can you pull up the last year
Sorry, I'm back.
of when the last year of the books was published? I'm picking up where we left off.
The last year the books were published?
The most recent book, whatever year the most recent book was published for the Dune series, because we were talking about copyright, because I don't know what it was.
It looks like 2022.
No, last year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, last year.
The Sands of Dune.
Oh, is it not Heir of Kaladin?
Oh, on Google Books, it's Sands of Dune. Dune franchise. Let's go to Wikipedia. Dune franchise.
The Heir of Kaladin, according to Wikipedia, 2022. Interesting. So they're still making these books. Okay, so they don't have any sort of copyright time frame running. If the assumption can be made that, like, if you put out something else that's in world per se or in brand, that it just keeps like starting fresh. That's interesting. Anyway, there's just a side quest that I wanted to go down real quick.
Well, here's the interesting side to your side quest. There have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, with the 7th one forthcoming, Dune video games.
Forthcoming? Wait, when? What?
Yep. 2023, which we're in the middle of, Dune Awakening. Last year, Dune Spice Wars came out.
Where?
By Shiro Games.
Okay.
Yeah, neither have I.
I remembered hearing about a game called Spice Wars, but I've done absolutely no looking into it at all. I've just heard that it's a thing that is going to exist.
Yeah, and 1992 is when Cryo Interactive published that game. The first Dune.
Interesting. I would be curious to play one of them in like old age, if you will.
Yeah, why not? Get a Let's Play going?
I don't have time for that. I'm trying to work on my MBA.
All right, so how are we ending this thing?
Well, I want to say that I want to thank you for having me on. There's the smallest minute details that we could go into, or the large macroscopic happenings across the universe and the implications, or the deeper themes about a particular moment, character interactions. There's so much that could be talked about, but there's only so many hours in the day and so many minutes in a podcast, and you could spend decades talking about it all.
Decades. All right, Chris is signed up for decades. Spence, you in for decades?
It sounds intriguing, but I've got other things to do, unfortunately.
Spencer goes back to the Cosmere.
Yeah, it's just you and me, Chris, because Jonathan has an MBA to do, and Spence just bowed out. So,
all right, well, we can discuss Dune, just the two of us, some other
sub
time.
podcast spun off from the podcast here. I like it, but we like to have some fun when we end these episodes as best as we can. So, a question came to me, and we did this back when we did the Wish episode about the monkey's paw. If you guys had to terraform this planet, and it's kind of like an RTS, right? Like, I'm trying to think of that Blizzard game. Space something. StarCraft. Thank you. I was like, space, whatever. Anyway, if you had to terraform a planet like Arrakis, or a planet... No, let's just stick with Arrakis. Just like stay on brand here, Jonathan. All right. If you had to terraform a planet, how would you go about it? Like, based on the details that were given, and you're the replacement for the Duke didn't get sent to Arrakis. You're a noble family who's sent over there who isn't necessarily in the political intrigue. Like the Baron Harkonnen is still trying to fight Duke Atreides, and so they're not necessarily fighting over Arrakis. You're just like the stand-in or surrogate family that has to go to Arrakis. What are you going to do? What are you going to try and do? Spencer, you're up first, because I'm taking this from a quote that you wrote down about the idea of working to terraform a planet in sci-fi.
I said I like the idea. I didn't say how I would do it.
Right, and so I'm forcing you to get creative.
Well, I guess something that comes to mind is the idea of having machines do your work for you. So I would maybe challenge that and develop machines or tools that could help me terraform a planet. One, because I am not creative enough to terraform a planet or figure out how to do it. So I would try to maybe develop a machine that could help me out. Yeah, I guess that's what I got there. We're getting back into using AI to our advantage.
And the Butlerian Jihad condemns you.
Never said I wanted to.
Well, I would take a page out of the RTS manual that Jonathan was proposing and do a how would you describe? I would do a crossover, the biggest crossover in history, Command and Conquer with Dune. I would get an alien substance of Tiberium to do the terraforming for me.
Oh, good. Is that your full answer, Chris? That's it? That's your... You don't want to go into details about changing the economy?
No more detail.
Being a dictator?
There's some parallels about a messiah and a warrior religion and all that sort of stuff mixed in there.
Fair enough.
Jonathan, what would you do? How would you terraform a planet?
Well, being the person that I am, I would probably zip into this space. I would start bringing upheaval to the economy that's there. And then I would start trying to empower mom and pop shop businesses to make like spice candies and additional products that we could sell to other nations to increase our GDP. I'm just like tapping into my full MBA here. We would increase our exports, and then we would gather the finances, and we would build the economy that is Arrakis. And then eventually we'd create an empire, and then we'd overthrow the Sardaukans, because I don't have anything better to do with my time. So get a lot of money, classic Jew, and then spend that money to own not just our planet, but the other planets by becoming emperor. I might have a god complex.
All right. Well, as I mentioned before we started recording, I think I would go the old exploit the natives with their religion and take over as a messiah head figure. I know it's kind of a cop-out, but that's honestly my answer. Like, how else will you do it?
To Spencer and Chris, do you think people would follow Slava as a messiah figure? Because I don't think he's got the charisma for it. I think he'd get too fed up and angry with the first person who challenged him, and he'd like kill a person to...
You know me so well, John.
Well, that's why you find someone to be your prophet, and then you can just be the guy in the background controlling the prophet.
Hey, Jonathan, after you're done with your MBA, you want to be a prophet?
What's that line that you wrote one time, Chris? I'm not a prophet, but I'm here to profit.
Was that me that wrote that? I'm pretty sure somebody far smarter than me is the one who first penned that phrase.
Were they? I don't remember. I thought it was you. Anyway, we're unraveling here, but I like it. I hope that you guys had fun on this episode on Arrakis. We are inviting you to follow our Spotify, and if you are so inclined, tell us what you thought of the book in the comments on Spotify or our socials. Until next time, continue side questing? Great. This is going to make the episode because Slava's just going to laugh at me.
Until you hit a roadblock on your main quest.
Continue
Goodbye,
questing.
good people.
No. Oh, my
fail.
God. All right.
Fail that skill check for the main quest. Come back to the side quest and grind.
Come back and grind it out.
I like that.
Continue to grind it out, people. Oh, just think about the Baron and his
Rub it
jowls. Whoa. Okay. Goodbye.